Now we're on to the subject of software now, and basically if you're going to put a PC in an arcade cabinet, you want some method of hiding the Windows environment. This basically makes things much more authentic. As you can see here, I've used a piece of software called mamewah, which is programmed by a guy who calls himself Minwah. And basically this graphical user interface can be entirely skinned. You can draw your own skins in Windows Paintbrush or Photoshop. And obviously the actual layout files, because it comes with a layout designer, and you basically lay where your boxes want to appear on the screen, as can be seen here. So what I'm now going to do is to give you a quick flick through of my emulators which are on the machine. This is an Atari 2600 emulator. Some of you might remember this from about 1976 to 78. It was basically a machine which plugged it into your TV. There you go, and it basically came with a Atari joystick and the console there which used cartridges. And I've used an emulator called Z26 to actually run all these ROM images, and it basically behaves exactly like the original machine. Go on to our next emulator. Atari 7800. Again, this was very similar in look to the Atari 2600, but it did use a slightly different joystick, as can be seen here. And again, all of those I can launch through the interface as well. And for actually launching these ROMs, I used an emulator called Mess, which is very similar to Mame, and it supports a lot of different systems. And here's our next emulator, which is the Atari Lynx. This was Atari's first handheld, I believe. It didn't get very far because of the actual battery life of the machine, but that's what it looked like. And this is the software which basically runs it. Again, I used a special emulator to actually run all these ROM images as well. Of course, scrolling through the games again gives us a screenshot of each game. This is my next emulator, which is the Fairchild Channel F, which was a very early 1970s gaming machine, as can be seen there. And of course we have all the games we can launch again. This is the next game selection screen, which covers all the Laserdisc games. Basically, you might remember from the 80s, before the invention of the CD, there was a 12-inch Laserdisc. A lot of these games actually came on these large 12-inch discs, such games as Dragon's Lair, Galaxy Ranger and Space Ace. These can be launched from the interface, and you can scroll the trackball here to select which one you wish to launch. So we just go on to our next emulator. This is Mame Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator. This emulates over 6,266 arcade machines at present, as of version 0.110, which is what I'm running on my cabinet. Obviously under mamewah, which is the interface software which I'm using, I've set up some hotkeys. This tells you if the game has any controls. If it does, and they're documented, it will list what button does what. To actually do this, it refers to a database file which I've set up, and this screen I basically designed myself. I just photographed my controller and overlaid this onto a blue backdrop. Let's see if I can find a game which actually has controls, just so I can show you. Right. There we go. This is for New Puck 2. Number of players 2 alternating, which means each player takes turns. And there we go. The original machine used a 4-way joystick, up, down, left, right controls there. If I press the next button on my control panel, this displays what each button does in mamewah. Obviously, again, I photographed my control panel, and and reprogram that what button does what. And as you can see here, obviously up and down the joystick goes up one game and down one game, left to right, up one letter, down one letter. Previous platform and next platform cycle between emulators on the machine. Controls viewer will display the controls for the actual game you have selected. Mamewah viewer is what you're viewing now. History viewer will display some history about the actual game you have selected. And cycle themes will cycle the themes through in mamewah. The last button, which isn't actually labelled, launches my jukebox software, which I have on the machine. So if I give you a quick demo of how history works, we'll just press the next button on the control panel. This gives us the history behind the game. Obviously, New Puck 2 was made in 1980. Central processing unit was a Z80, and sound chips was Namco's own sound system. Okay, we'll just come out of that. Here's the next emulator which is on my machine. This was the Neo Geo Pocket, which was a very popular handheld console in Japan. You can see them here. The software I have on here basically will run all these images. The actual emulator is a bit buggy, but it will run some games. So I've got about 256 ROM images on here at the moment. Let's go to the next emulator. This is the Sega Genesis, or what was known in the UK as the Sega Mega Drive. And of course you had Sonic the Hedgehog and all other classics on here. Again, there's 5,871 games actually sat on here at the moment. Again, all these are selectable. Obviously some of them have screenshots which I've added. Okay, we'll just flip to the next emulator. Here we go, the Sega Master System. Some of you might remember this from the 1980s. It came with games such as Duck Shoot and Super Hang-On. As far as I'm aware, I think it was Nintendo's first gaming system. And on here there's 1026 ROMs, which are all launchable again via the actual mamewah interface. Let's go on to the next platform. Super Nintendo. Again, 3,761 games for this. All these are launchable and have screenshots for each particular game which I've set up. And this is what the actual Super Nintendo used to look like. As you can see, it was a games console which took cartridges. In its heyday, it was very successful. Now, this is a Vectrex emulator. The Vectrex was quite an unusual games console in that it didn't plug into a TV, it actually came with its own screen. Obviously that was the console, and that was the actual controller you used to actually play your games with. The games really comprised of just vector graphics, but it was way ahead of its day, and it was actually very successful. Well, one of my most remembered games was a game called Spike from 1983.